In the dead of winter in 1887, a temperature of 40 degrees below zero could freeze a man's lungs from the inside out in less than 3 breaths, yet Native American mothers slept soundly through the night with their infants resting peacefully beside them in light cotton tunics. To an outsider standing on the frozen, wind-scoured expanses of the Dakota Territory during that brutal November, such a statement sounded like pure madness or sheer fantasy. The northern plains do not offer gentle warnings when winter arrives. Instead, the weather strikes with the crushing force of a physical wall, bringing a blinding vortex of white noise, horizontal ice crystals, and a cold so absolute that it swallows sound itself. Out on those endless grasslands, there was no tree line to break the assault of the Canadian Arctic air mass, no mountain ridge to hide behind, and absolutely nothing standing between a fragile human body and the frozen sky, except whatever shelter that human had constructed with their own hands. When temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, the wind driven across the open prairie reached sustained speeds of 60 miles per hour. At that velocity, microscopic ice crystals did not fall from above. They moved horizontally across the landscape, like millions of tiny needles pushed by an invisible, relentless hand. If you stepped outside wearing standard wool coat layers without specialized windproofing, the gale stripped heat away from your skin so fast that early stages of hypothermia set in within minutes, followed swiftly by severe frostbite and death. Yet, for countless generations across thousands of years, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Dakota families lay down inside their winter encampments on these exact blizzard nights and fell into deep, restorative sleep. They did not lie awake shivering in terror, nor did they barely survive until dawn. They slept warmly, deeply, and comfortably, cradling their children in spaces where small fires breathed gently in the dark and the air remained as mild as an autumn evening. This is not a simple story about barely enduring a harsh environment through raw willpower. It is a story about mastering the environment completely through a brilliant understanding of natural physics, materials, and human physiology. Before we journey deeper into the incredible mechanics of how this was accomplished, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from today, as well as the coldest winter temperature you have ever personally survived. Every single week, we dive deep into forgotten historical engineering and survival wisdom that kept people alive when failure was not an option. And your support helps us bring these forgotten stories back to light. To truly understand how this level of comfort was possible, you have to look at the staggering numbers that defied every assumption made by European settlers and military engineers who arrived on the frontier in the late 19th century. When a blizzard raged across the Dakota Territory at 40 degrees below zero, the interior of a properly constructed Lakota winter lodge held steady at 65 degrees above zero, near the sleeping area. That is an astonishing temperature differential of 105 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained entirely without commercial fuel, without cast iron stoves, without glass insulation, and without electricity. Even more incredible was the fact that a Lakota winter lodge consumed less than 20% of the firewood that a standard timber building required, all while keeping its occupants significantly warmer, healthier, and safer throughout the entire winter season. The secret did not lie in burning massive quantities of wood in a roaring bonfire, nor did it lie in thick, heavy walls that simply tried to brute force their way against the wind. Instead, it was an interconnected web of microengineering that treated the shelter, the hearth, the bedding, the food consumed before sleep, and even human metabolic heat as part of a single, continuous thermal envelope. While European builders were cutting down entire forests to feed massive fireplaces that bled 80% of their heat straight out of the chimney, Indigenous builders were guiding air currents, trapping dead air, and storing radiant energy in stone and earth with breathtaking precision. In November 1887, as the sky over the upper Missouri River Valley turned a bruised, leaden gray that signaled the approach of one of the deadliest winters in recorded American history, two completely different visions of human shelter stood just 3 miles apart along the riverbank. On the east side of the river stood Fort Standing Stone, a brand-new $15,000 military garrison constructed by the United States Army, built using steam-milled pine planks, heavy iron hardware, imported coal, and massive cast-iron potbelly stoves. It was hailed by its commander as a triumph of modern industrial progress, a wooden fortress designed to bring civilizing comfort to the wild frontier. On the west side of the river, nestled in a sheltered cottonwood bend, where the riverbank sloped gently toward the water, sat the winter camp of a Lakota band led by an elder named Tokahe. Tokahe was a master lodge builder and a deeply observant strategist of the natural world, a man who had spent 60 winters watching how snow drifted, how wind reacted to rounded surfaces, and how stone held onto the memory of heat long after coals turned to ash. Tokahe's people built their camp using buffalo hides, willow poles, river stones, prairie grass, and river mud. To the officers at the fort, Tokahe's camp looked like a collection of temporary, primitive tents scattered in the brush. To Tokahe, the military fort looked like a noisy, inefficient box of wind drafts and fire hazards that would consume its own fuel and freeze its occupants the moment a real Arctic storm arrived. The stage was set for a confrontation not between weapons or armies, but between two fundamentally different philosophies of building. One side believed that comfort was achieved by fighting nature with heavy machinery and endless fuel. The other side knew that true warmth was achieved by understanding the laws of thermodynamics and working in complete harmony with them. As the first scattered flakes of the great winter of 1887 began to fall over the Dakota plains, no one inside the wooden walls of Fort Standing Stone realized that they were about to receive a humbling lesson in survival from the very people they viewed as primitive. Captain Thaddeus Vance of the United States Army garrison at Fort Standing Stone was a man who put his absolute faith in blueprinted diagrams, industrial sawmills, and the unstoppable march of modern technology. Freshly appointed to his command after years of service in established eastern posts, Vance viewed his new assignment in the Dakota Territory as a chance to prove how effective modern American engineering could be when deployed against the harsh wilderness. When he drew up the plans for Fort Standing Stone during the mild summer of 1887, he spared no expense. He ordered thousands of feet of double-planked pine timber from the mills in Minnesota, tons of structural iron bolts, glass window panes, and 36 heavy cast-iron potbelly stoves capable of burning both hardwood cordwood and imported Pennsylvania coal. To Captain Vance, his new garrison was a masterpiece of strength and modern comfort. The main barracks were long, imposing rectangular buildings with high ceilings, polished wood floors elevated 6 inches above the soil, and large glass windows designed to let in natural daylight. Stately stone chimneys rose above the shingled roofs, and massive coal bins along the perimeter held high-grade fuel hauled in by supply wagons at immense financial cost. Vance walked through the barracks in October, knocking his knuckles against the sturdy pine walls and smiling with deep satisfaction. He boasted to his junior officer, Ensign Eli Hayes, that the garrison represented the absolute pinnacle of human architecture, a place where civilized men could work and sleep in total comfort, regardless of what the wild Dakota prairie threw at them. Yet, despite all the money spent and all the timber hauled across the plains, Captain Vance's magnificent garrison suffered from fundamental engineering flaws that every experienced frontier builder should have recognized immediately. The long, flat, rectangular exterior walls presented a massive surface area directly to the path of the prevailing northwest gales. When the wind blew across the open plains, it hit those straight wooden walls like a battering ram, creating immense surface pressure that forced cold air through every tiny seam, nail hole, and window frame joint. Furthermore, the high ceilings inside the barracks created a massive, useless overhead space where all the warm air naturally rose and pooled, leaving the floor level where the soldiers slept trapped in a perpetual draft of sinking cold air. Because the barracks were raised on wooden joists, 6 inches off the ground to keep them level, the sub-zero wind blew freely underneath the floorboards. The floor became a giant thermal drain, drawing heat straight out of the soldiers' boots and bed frames through direct conduction into the frozen soil beneath the building. To combat this constant heat loss, Vance's men had to run the cast-iron potbelly stoves at near maximum capacity, burning through cords of wood and tons of coal every single week, just to keep the interior air tolerable. The iron stoves, threw off intense, scorching heat within a 6-foot radius, but beyond that small circle, the air temperature plummeted rapidly toward the freezing mark. It was an active, high-consumption heating setup that relied entirely on a constant supply of external fuel and non-stop human effort to keep the fires stoked every hour of the day and night. Just 3 miles down the river, Tokahe and his Lakota band were preparing their winter quarters using a method that was the complete opposite of Captain Vance's heavy timber fortress. Tokahe did not select a flat, exposed rise for his camp. Instead, he chose a low river bend surrounded by dense stands of native willow and cottonwood trees. The trees acted as a natural windbreak, breaking up the high-velocity surface gales long before they could reach the shelters. Tokahe carefully surveyed the ground, studying the way groundwater drained, the direction of the seasonal winds, and the way snow drifted during early autumn flurries. He knew that a winter camp had to be positioned with mathematical precision relative to the landscape, taking full advantage of natural wind barriers, southern solar exposure, and earth insulation. When Captain Vance led a routine mounted patrol along the Missouri River in late November, he rode past the Lakota encampment and pulled his horse to a halt. He looked down from his saddle at the cluster of conical hide lodges and earth-mounded shelters nestled among the river cottonwoods. To Vance's eyes, trained in formal military draftsmanship, the camp looked crude, fragile, and utterly inadequate for a Dakota winter. He saw hide covers pegged to the ground, smoke rising gently from top flaps, and women packing earth and snow around the bases of the lodges. It seemed impossible to him that thin animal skins and wooden poles could offer any real protection against the sub-zero temperatures that were already beginning to settle over the territory. Vance dismounted and walked into the camp alongside Ensign Hayes, seeking out Tokahe near the center of the lodge circle. Through an interpreter, Vance expressed what he believed was genuine concern for the native family groups. He informed Tokahe that his officers had logged a temperature reading of 6 degrees below zero the previous night, warning the elder that the true winter storms had not even begun. Vance offered to supply Tokahe's people with surplus government coal and army canvas tents, asserting that without heavy timber walls, iron stoves, and fossil fuels, no human family could survive the severe storms that were known to sweep down from the Canadian border. Tokahe listened politely, his weathered face showing neither anger nor surprise at the officer's condescending offer. He looked at Captain Vance's heavy wool overcoat, his thick leather riding boots, and the way the captain was already shifting his weight from foot to foot to keep the cold ground from numbing his toes. Tokahe calmly declined the offer of coal and canvas. He explained to the captain that coal fires burned too hot, produced dangerous smoke that dried out the air, and required constant feeding, whereas the Lakota lodges were designed to hold heat using the natural warmth of the earth, the stones from the river, and the very air trapped within the lodge walls. Tokahe told the officer that a good house does not fight the wind with heavy walls. A good house lets the wind slide harmlessly over its back, while holding the warmth of the hearth close to the bodies of the people sleeping inside. Vance chuckled softly at the response, viewing Tokahe's words as poetical native folklore rather than actual scientific building knowledge. He shook his head, remounted his horse, and told Ensign Hayes, as they rode back to Fort Standing Stone, that the old elder's stubborn adherence to primitive traditions would cost his people dearly before the winter was over. Vance was so confident in his military garrison's superior design that he made a wager with his junior officers. Within 24 hours of the first major Arctic blizzard, the Lakota would be forced to come to the fort begging for shelter, coal, and emergency blankets to keep their children from freezing in their hides. To the untrained eye of an army officer like Captain Vance, a Lakota teepee looked like nothing more than a simple cone of tanned buffalo hides stretched over a frame of wooden poles. But in reality, a winter lodge was a highly sophisticated thermal machine, an architectural structure whose interior setup changed completely between day and night to handle extreme temperature drops. During the bright daylight hours, when occupants moved in and out, cooked meals, and worked on tools, the teepee was configured for open-air circulation and light. But as the sun dipped below the western horizon and the prairie air turned bitterly cold, the lodge underwent a deliberate transformation that converted it into an airtight, super-insulated living space. The heart of this thermal transformation was a feature that few European observers ever understood: the ozan, or inner hide lining. The ozan was a secondary wall made of carefully tanned, softened buffalo hides that hung around the entire interior circumference of the teepee. It was suspended from the lodge poles at a height of roughly 7 feet and extended all the way down to the ground, where it was tucked tightly beneath the floor mats. Crucially, this inner lining did not sit flat against the outer lodge cover. Instead, it hung suspended exactly 12 inches inward from the outer hides, held away from the frame by wooden pegs and ties. This 12-inch gap between the inner lining and the outer hide cover created a continuous, vertical, horseshoe-shaped channel of dead air that wrapped entirely around the living area. In the science of building thermodynamics, dead air is one of the most effective natural insulators in existence. When air is trapped inside a narrow, enclosed space and prevented from forming large circulation loops, it loses its ability to transfer heat via convection. The air caught inside that 12-inch gap simply sat still, acting as a powerful buffer that blocked the cold of the outer hide wall from reaching the inner living space. That single air gap raised the ambient sleeping temperature inside the teepee by as much as 20 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit before a single log was even placed on the fire. Outside the lodge, the women of the camp executed another crucial engineering step. They gathered fresh, soft prairie snow and packed it around the exterior base of the teepee in a continuous, smooth ring that stood roughly 2 to 3 feet high. However, they applied this snow ring using a method that required deep, practical experience. They never allowed the snow to press directly against the main hide cover of the lodge. If wet snow touched the buffalo hide directly, the hide would wick moisture from the snowpack through capillary action, causing the hide to freeze stiff, lose its flexibility, and begin rotting from the outside in over time. To prevent this wicking action, the women first laid down a buffer layer of dry willow brush and coarse river reeds against the outer hide. Only then did they pack the snow against that brush framework. This created an intentional, small air gap between the outer hide cover and the snow wall, preventing any moisture transfer, while using the dense snowpack to completely seal the base of the lodge against ground drafts. Snow itself contains up to 90% trapped air, making a packed snowbank an extraordinary insulator, with an R value of roughly R1 per inch. A 3-foot-thick snow wall packed around the base eliminated draft entry at the floor level, where cold air normally crept into a shelter. For extreme cold snaps, Tokahe's people added another layer of performance to this double-walled system. They took dried prairie grass, gathered in vast quantities during the late autumn harvest, and stuffed it loosely into the 12-inch gap between the inner lining and the outer cover. The dry grass trapped millions of additional microscopic air pockets, transforming the teepee's lower wall envelope into a solid, high-density insulating barrier that rivaled modern fiberglass insulation. Finally, Tokahe installed the horizontal ceiling panel over the main sleeping area. This was a wide sheet of lightweight, brain-tanned deerskin, stretched horizontally across the interior lodge poles at a height of about 6.5 feet, directly above where the beds were laid out. Because warm air naturally rises due to lower density, the heat generated by the hearth fire and the bodies of the occupants would normally climb straight up to the apex of the teepee and escape out through the smoke hole. The horizontal ceiling panel interrupted this upward thermal climb. It caught the rising warm air, trapping a thick cushion of heat directly over the sleeping family. The warm air sat suspended overhead like a thermal blanket, while the smoke from the central hearth was guided smoothly past the edge of the panel and out through the upper smoke flaps. The occupants slept beneath a stable ceiling of warm air, completely sheltered from cold drafts above and below. In early December, as the first light dustings of winter snow began to coat the Dakota prairie, Ensign Eli Hayes rode out from Fort Standing Stone under orders from Captain Vance to conduct a formal survey of the river valley. Hayes was a young, observant officer who had studied civil engineering at West Point, and while he shared his captain's pride in military infrastructure, he possessed a natural curiosity about how indigenous people managed to thrive in environments that routinely defeated European armies. When Hayes arrived at Tokahe's encampment, he found the elder and his sons putting the finishing touches on an earth-mounded pit shelter, a semi-subterranean structure built for the oldest members of the band who required absolute thermal stability. Hayes dismounted and walked around the excavation, taking out a small leather-bound notebook and a brass slide rule to record measurements. What he saw defied every standard rule of military field fortification. Tokahe had excavated a circular pit 4 feet deep into the river bench soil, using the stable 5-foot earth depth where ground temperatures remain near 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Over this circular pit, he had erected a heavy timber frame made of thick cottonwood logs, weaving willow branches over the rafters, layering thick prairie grass over the branches, and finally packing a 12-inch layer of heavy river clay and sod over the entire dome until it looked like a natural mound rising from the earth. Captain Vance, who had ridden out shortly behind his ensign to check on the survey work, arrived at the pit shelter and looked at the structure with obvious disdain. He stood on the edge of the earth mound, folded his arms across his chest, and openly mocked the design in front of the assembled soldiers and Lakota builders. Vance pointed out what he believed were obvious structural and health hazards. He declared that digging 4 feet into the dirt was a guaranteed way to flood the shelter during a thaw, that packing a foot of earth overhead would crush the wooden rafters the moment a heavy snow load accumulated, and that the complete lack of large wall windows would cause the occupants to suffocate from smoke and carbon monoxide within hours of lighting a fire. Tokahe listened to the translation of the captain's critique without reacting to the officer's abrasive tone. Instead of arguing, Tokahe motioned for Ensign Hayes and Captain Vance to step down into the entrance of the Earth Lodge so they could see the internal mechanics for themselves. As Hayes stepped into the entryway, he immediately noticed that he was not walking straight into the main room. Instead, he was standing in a narrow, angled entrance tunnel that sloped slightly upward toward the inner room. The tunnel was lined with smooth stone slabs and featured a low, curved stone wall, a draft deflector, standing directly between the inner tunnel opening and the central fire pit. Tokahe explained the physics of this entrance system to the young ensign. When cold outside air attempted to enter the shelter, its higher density caused it to hug the floor of the entrance tunnel. As it reached the inner room, it struck the stone deflector wall. The deflector stopped the cold air from rushing across the floor where people slept, forcing the incoming air to detour around the base of the central fire pit. There, the cold air was instantly heated by the glowing coals, expanding and rising smoothly into the upper room, where it created a gentle, natural air draft that drew fresh oxygen into the lodge while pushing stale air and smoke out through a small, stone-lined vent in the roof peak. Ensign Hayes leaned down and held his bare hand near the base of the stone deflector. He was astonished to feel a steady, gentle draw of fresh air, moving toward the fire, with 0 turbulent drafts spilling over into the surrounding sleeping benches. He took out his thermometer and checked the air temperature inside the Earth Lodge. Outside, the prairie wind was blowing at 20 miles per hour, with a temperature of 12 degrees above zero. Inside the unlit Earth Lodge, relying only on the thermal mass of the 4-foot dirt walls and the natural heat of the ground, the mercury registered 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Captain Vance looked at the thermometer reading, narrowed his eyes, and dismissed the result. He asserted that 52 degrees was merely an anomaly caused by mild autumn ground conditions, maintaining that once a real northern blizzard arrived and frozen soil temperatures dropped deep into the earth, the mud walls would turn into an icebox. He told Hayes to close his notebook, declaring that no amount of primitive mud packing could substitute for an iron stove, a dry timber frame, and a steady supply of hard coal. As the officers turned to leave, Vance warned Tokahe one last time that his mud and hide structures were an accident waiting to happen, predicting that when the true storm hit, the earth roof would collapse under the weight of the snow and smother everyone inside. While Captain Vance focused entirely on external structures, Tokahe understood that staying warm through an Arctic blizzard required managing the internal energy sources operating inside the shelter. A building, no matter how well insulated, is ultimately just a shell. Without an internal heat battery and a continuous source of thermal energy, any space will eventually cool down to match the temperature of the outside world. Tokahe's approach to internal heat management was built around two powerful natural energy sources that modern builders consistently overlooked: high-density stone thermal mass and human metabolic heat generation. Long before the December storms arrived, Tokahe and the young men of the camp made repeated trips down to the bed of the Missouri River to harvest specific types of stones. They did not select light, porous rocks like shale or soft sandstone, which crack easily when heated and hold very little energy. Instead, they searched specifically for dense, dark, river-washed granite and limestone boulders ranging in size from 10 to 30 pounds. These heavy, tight-grained stones possessed an exceptionally high specific heat capacity, meaning they could absorb vast quantities of thermal energy when exposed to fire and release that energy at a remarkably steady rate over many hours. Inside the tipis and earth lodges, these river stones were arranged in a dense ring around the central hearth pit. During the late afternoon and early evening, as the main fire was kept burning to cook the evening meal, these stones sat directly in the bed of hot coals, absorbing the intense radiant heat that would otherwise be lost to the upper atmosphere. By nightfall, when the main flames were allowed to die down to prevent smoke buildup and fuel waste, the stone ring had become a fully charged thermal battery. The granite boulders glowed with a deep, invisible infrared heat, reaching surface temperatures of several hundred degrees. Before the family lay down to sleep, the adults used wooden tongs to move several of these hot river stones out of the central fire pit and shift them directly into small, shallow depressions dug beneath the edge of the sleeping platforms. They wrapped each hot stone in a layer of damp river mud, followed by a thick wrapping of green buffalo hide with the hair left on. This protective wrapping served a vital dual purpose. It prevented the extreme heat of the stone from scorching the bedding above, and it acted as a thermal regulator, slowing down the rate of heat dissipation. A single 30-pound granite stone prepared in this manner would continuously radiate gentle, soothing warmth directly upward into the sleeping platform for 6 to 8 hours, keeping the sleepers warm from below even after the main fire pit had reduced to faint, glowing embers. Equally important to Tokahe's thermal strategy was the biological heat produced by the human body itself. Modern building engineers know that a resting adult human body functions as an 80-watt biological heater, continuously radiating heat as a natural byproduct of cellular metabolism. In a lodge housing 10 family members, those human bodies generated a combined, continuous thermal output of 800 watts, the equivalent of running a small electric space heater all night long inside a small, super-insulated space. To maximize this biological heat generator, Tokahe's people paid careful attention to what they ate before going to sleep. On the eve of a blizzard, the evening meal was never light or watery. It was rich in animal fats and concentrated proteins, centered around pemmican. Pemmican was a dense, highly nutritious survival food made from dried, powdered buffalo meat, mixed with equal parts rendered tallow fat and dried choke cherries. A single pound of high-grade pemmican packed over 3,500 calories, delivering a concentrated dose of long-burning lipids that required hours of sustained chemical digestion by the human body. When a person consumed a portion of pemmican before lying down under their buffalo robes, their digestive system went to work processing those heavy fats throughout the night. This metabolic activity sparked a physiological process known as diet-induced thermogenesis, causing the body's internal core temperature to rise slightly and increasing peripheral blood flow to the hands and feet. The sleepers were literally running an internal chemical furnace that generated constant body heat from the inside out, while their brain-tan buffalo robes trapped that heat close to the skin, and the hot river stones beneath their beds pushed warmth up from the earth below. Stay with us, because what happened when the great winter storm finally struck the territory on January 12th would put both building philosophies to the ultimate physical test, producing a mathematical result that shocked the military officers at Fort Standing Stone and silenced every critic along the Missouri River. The morning of the 12th of January 1888 began with a strange, unnatural gentleness across the Dakota Territory. The air was surprisingly mild for midwinter, hovering near 15 degrees above zero, and a heavy, dead calm hung over the river valley. Children in settler cabins and near the fort walked outside without their heavy winter coats, laughing and enjoying what many assumed was a brief break in the winter weather. But Tokahe knew that this dead calm was a trap. He stepped out of his lodge at dawn, looked up at the sky, and noted the behavior of the birds along the riverbank. They were not flying. They were huddled deep within the willow thickets, their feathers puffed up, entirely silent. By mid-morning, the barometer experienced one of the most violent drops ever recorded in the history of North American meteorology. Within less than an hour, the sky transformed from a dull gray to a dark, bruising purple-black. Then, without a single moment of gradual warning, the storm struck. It did not begin with a gentle snowfall. It hit like an explosive blast of cold air tearing down from the Arctic Circle. The temperature plummeted at a terrifying rate, dropping more than 50 degrees in less than 4 hours, eventually reaching 42 degrees below zero by nightfall. Accompanying this sudden drop was a ferocious wind that sustained speeds of 65 miles per hour, with gusts recorded at over 80 miles per hour along the open river benches. The wind picked up the dry, powdered snow from the prairie floor and mixed it with fresh, needle-sharp ice crystals falling from the sky, creating a wall of white noise so dense that visibility was reduced to less than 2 feet. A person standing on the porch of a building could not see their own boots, let alone the outline of a structure 20 yards away. The roar of the wind was so deafening that human voices were swallowed instantly, sounding like faint whispers even when screaming at the top of their lungs. Inside Tokahe's winter camp, the band's preparation paid off immediately. The circular, conical shape of the tipis offered virtually no flat resistance to the screaming gale. The 65-mile-per-hour winds hit the curved hide walls and slid smoothly around and over the tops of the lodges, creating a natural aerodynamic deflection that prevented wind pressure from building up against any single point of the frame. While the outer hide covers fluttered and creaked under the immense wind velocity, the structural poles beneath remained rock-solid, anchored firmly into the frozen ground, and weighted down by the internal structural mass. As the storm intensified, Tokahe stepped outside for a brief moment to make critical adjustments to the lodge's upper smoke flaps. Using the long external adjustment poles attached to the flap peaks, he angled the hide flaps so that they sat downwind, facing away from the prevailing blast. This created a powerful low-pressure vacuum zone directly over the smoke hole outlet, a fluid dynamics mechanism known as the Venturi effect. Instead of the wind blowing cold air down into the lodge, the wind rushing over the top of the flaps actively pulled air up through the teepee, creating an upward draw that sucked out smoke while leaving the lower living area completely still and clear. Inside the tipis, the family settled into their carefully organized night positions. The low, baffled entryways performed flawlessly, neutralizing the wind pressure so completely that the flame of a small tallow lamp placed near the inner door flapped only gently in the air. The 2-foot-thick ring of snow packed around the base blocked every trace of ground-level draft, while the prairie grass stuffed inside the inner lining gap held the trapped dead air motionless against the freezing cold outside. The family arranged themselves on the raised sleeping platforms according to their well-tested social geometry. In the center, closest to the hearth ring and directly above the buried hot river stones, slept the elderly, the infants, and the young children, the individuals whose small bodies lost heat most rapidly. Flanking them on the outer edges of the platform slept the healthy adults, their larger body masses acting as a secondary biological heat shield. Even the camp's working dogs were brought inside and instructed to lie down along the inner perimeter near the door, their thick furred bodies adding another several hundred watts of biological heat to the enclosed space. By 8 o'clock that evening, as the blizzard raged outside with a wind chill factor approaching 80 degrees below zero, the interior of Tokahe's lodge reached a state of stable thermal equilibrium. The small hearth fire burned cleanly, fed by tight-twisted bundles of dry prairie grass and dry cottonwood splits that produced minimal smoke and maximum radiant heat. The granite river stones in the hearth pit absorbed that radiant heat, while the wrapped stones beneath the sleeping platforms pushed a steady stream of warmth up through the buffalo robes. The family removed their heavy outer parkas and fur boots, resting comfortably under 2 layers of brain-tanned winter hides in their light tunic clothes. They were not merely enduring the worst storm in Dakota history, they were living in quiet, relaxed comfort while the Arctic furnace raged uselessly outside their walls. 3 miles away, inside the wooden walls of Fort Standing Stone, the great blizzard of 1888 was executing a brutal destruction of Captain Thaddeus Vance's modern engineering assumptions. When the storm hit at mid-morning, the wind struck the long, flat, pine-board sidewalls of the soldier barracks with the force of a runaway locomotive. The timber frame groaned and creaked under the sudden wind pressure, and within minutes, the limits of the garrison's construction became painfully obvious to every man trapped inside. The first major failure occurred in the building's heating and ventilation setup. As the 65-mile-per-hour gales swept over the roofline of the barracks, the wind created massive, high-pressure zones around the tops of the exposed brick and tin chimneys. Instead of smoke drawing smoothly up through the flues, the wind forced powerful air currents directly down the chimney pipes, causing violent backdrafts inside the potbelly stoves. Within 20 minutes of the storm's onset, the cast-iron stoves began spewing thick clouds of black coal smoke and acrid hardwood soot directly into the living quarters. The air inside the barracks quickly became unbreathable. Soldiers coughed, choked, and rubbed their burning eyes as the dense smoke filled the high, vaulted ceilings and began descending toward the floor. To keep from suffocating, Captain Vance was forced to order his men to open the upper transom windows an inch or two to allow the smoke to escape. But that tiny opening proved catastrophic for the building's internal temperature. The sub-zero Arctic wind rushed through the open transom windows like a pressurized hose, instantly destroying whatever warm air had managed to accumulate near the ceiling. As the cold air rushed in above, it created a massive convective loop that drew frigid air up through the floorboards from the open 6-inch gap beneath the elevated building. The polished pine floorboards, which Vance had been so proud of during the summer, became freezing cold. Water spilled onto the floor near the wash basins, froze solid into sheets of ice within 15 minutes. The temperature at floor level, where the soldiers' iron cot beds were positioned, dropped at a terrifying rate. By 6 o'clock in the evening, despite the cast-iron stoves glowing cherry red from non-stop firing, the thermometer mounted on the central barracks wall registered just 22 degrees Fahrenheit above zero. The situation degenerated rapidly into a crisis of fuel and human stamina. Because the thin pine walls possessed zero thermal mass, they could not store heat energy. The moment a fire in a potbelly stove began to dip even slightly, the interior air temperature plummeted instantly. The soldiers were forced to maintain an intense, high-consumption firing routine, shoveling coal and feeding heavy hardwood logs into the iron stoves every 15 to 20 minutes. But the intense heat generated by the glowing iron stoves was immediately stripped away by the wind, scouring the outside of the thin pine siding. By midnight on the second day of the storm, Fort Standing Stone was running dangerously low on accessible fuel. The main coal bins were located outside in a storage shed 40 yards from the main barracks building. In the total whiteout conditions of the blizzard, traversing that 40-yard distance had become a life-threatening undertaking. 2 soldiers who attempted to haul coal buckets back to the barracks lost their footing in a snowdrift, became completely disoriented by the blinding white noise, and were found hours later huddled against a fence line, suffering from severe frostbite on their hands, ears, and feet. Desperate to conserve fuel and keep his men alive, Captain Vance was forced to abandon 3 of the garrison's 4 main barracks buildings, crowding all 60 soldiers into the single smallest room in the headquarters facility. The men brought their wool blankets, mattresses, and personal gear, piling them against the north and west walls to block the cold air whistling through the wall seams. But even with 60 adult men crammed into a single space, the building's poor insulation and drafty floor construction meant that human body heat was lost almost as fast as it was produced. The cast-iron stoves, pushed far beyond their design limits for 36 continuous hours, began to suffer mechanical failures. The severe heat warped the iron firebox doors, preventing them from closing properly and creating dangerous sparks that threatened to ignite the dry pine floorboards. To prevent a catastrophic fire, the soldiers had to damp down the primary stove, causing the room temperature to drop to 12 degrees above zero. Men lay in their cots wrapped in 4 layers of wool military blankets, wearing their heavy wool overcoats, fur caps, and leather mittens, shivering uncontrollably as they listened to the wind tear shingles off the roof overhead. Ensign Eli Hayes, sitting on an inverted crate near the center of the room with his hands wrapped around a tin mug of lukewarm coffee, watched Captain Vance pace back and forth across the ice-crusted floor. The captain's face was pale, his lips were blue, and his confidence was completely gone. He kept looking at the door, listening to the relentless roar of the wind, genuinely terrified that the building would either lose its roof or run out of fuel before the storm broke. For the first time in his military career, Vance realized that all his formal education, all his expensive industrial lumber, and all his imported coal were completely useless against the physical reality of a Dakota blizzard. As he shivered in his heavy wool coat inside his brand-new fortress, Vance silently wondered if anyone in the river valley, including Tokahe's band 3 miles away, could possibly survive a storm of this magnitude. On the morning of the 16th of January 1888, the great blizzard finally broke. The wind died down to a gentle breeze, and the sun rose into a sky so intense and crystalline blue that the blinding white reflection off the snow hurt the eyes. The landscape had been altered completely. Massive snowdrifts, hard-packed by 60-mile-per-hour winds, stretched across the prairie like frozen ocean waves, some reaching heights of 12 to 15 feet. The temperature, freed from the cloud cover of the storm, stood at an absolute, shivering 40 degrees below zero. At Fort Standing Stone, the morning revealed a scene of near disaster. 3 of the secondary outbuildings had suffered roof damage, 2 supply horses had frozen to death in a drafty barn, and 14 soldiers were receiving treatment from the garrison surgeon for varying degrees of frostbite and severe respiratory distress caused by 3 days of breathing concentrated coal smoke. The garrison had burned through more than 2 tons of high-grade coal and 3 full cords of hardwood in just 96 hours, virtually exhausting their winter fuel reserves in a single storm event. Captain Vance, driven by a mixture of official duty and a deep, unsettling fear of what he might find, ordered Ensign Hayes and a detail of 4 mounted soldiers to saddle horses and clear a path toward the river valley. Vance was convinced that Tokahe's winter camp had been wiped out. In his mind, if a $15,000 timber garrison with iron stoves had barely survived the storm, a collection of hide tents and mud-mounded shelters must have been flattened by the wind, leaving its occupants frozen in the drifts. He brought along extra army blankets, stretcher poles, and medical supplies, preparing himself for a tragic recovery operation. The patrol struggled through the deep snowdrifts for nearly 2 hours, taking a tortuous route along the river bench where the wind had scoured the ridges clear. As they rounded the Cottonwood Bend and came in sight of Tokahe's camp, Vance pulled his reins tight and stared in utter disbelief. The camp was still standing. The conical tipis, far from being crushed or blown away, sat quietly among the trees, buried up to their midsections in soft, protective snowdrifts that contoured smoothly around their curved hide walls. From the top flaps of every single teepee and earth lodge, thin, steady wisps of light gray wood smoke rose straight up into the clear winter air, signaling that fires were burning gently inside every shelter. Vance dismounted, his heavy boots crunching loudly through the snow crust, and walked cautiously toward Tokahe's main lodge alongside Ensign Hayes. There were no signs of panic, no frozen livestock, and no emergency digging. In fact, 2 young Lakota boys were already outside near the edge of the camp, wearing light fur wraps and laughing as they cleared snow away from the water access hole in the river ice. Vance reached the low, snow-banked entrance of Tokahe's tipi, bent down, and called out into the entryway. A moment later, Tokahe pulled back the inner hide door flap and invited the officers to enter. Vance and Hayes ducked their heads, crawled through the baffled double-entrance tunnel, and stepped across the threshold into the interior living space. The sensory impact was so immediate and overwhelming that both officers stopped dead in their tracks. They did not step into a cold, dark, damp tent. They stepped into a bright, dry, radiant paradise of warmth. The interior air hit Vance's frozen face like a wave of warm summer breeze. He instinctively reached up and unbuttoned the collar of his heavy wool overcoat, feeling his cheeks flush as his frozen skin began to thaw out. The air inside the lodge was clear, fresh, and completely free of the choking black smoke that had filled the military barracks. A small, modest bed of red cottonwood coals burned quietly in the central hearth pit, throwing off a gentle, steady heat. The river stones surrounding the pit glowed with stored energy, radiating warmth in all directions. Hanging overhead, the horizontal hide ceiling panel held a stable cushion of warm air directly over the living area, while the inner hide lining blocked every trace of the 40 below zero cold raging on the other side of the wall. Tokahe was sitting comfortably on a raised platform, lined with thick buffalo robes, wearing a simple cotton tunic and soft leather leggings. His wife was sitting nearby, working on a pair of beaded moccasins, while his grandchildren slept peacefully under a loose buffalo robe on the far side of the hearth. None of them were shivering. None of them were wearing coats, hats, or mittens inside the shelter. The interior of the teepee was so warm, so quiet, and so utterly comfortable that it felt as if the Arctic blizzard of the last 4 days had taken place on a completely different planet. Ensign Hayes pulled his military survey thermometer from his coat pocket, holding it at chest height in the middle of the sleeping area. He watched the red column of alcohol climb rapidly up the glass scale, 10 degrees, 30 degrees, 50 degrees, before finally settling at 65 degrees Fahrenheit above zero. Outside, the patrol's thermometer registered 40 below zero. The hide lodge was holding an internal temperature 75 degrees warmer than the outside air, operating on nothing more than a handful of cottonwood splits and the ancient physical principles built into its walls. Vance stood in the center of the lodge, looking at the sleeping children, looking at the dry floorboards, looking at the glowing stones, unable to utter a single word. Realizing the historic importance of what he was witnessing, Ensign Eli Hayes sat down on a wooden bench inside Tokahe's lodge, opened his official Army survey ledger, and began recording a technical comparison of the two shelters. As an engineer trained in mathematical analysis, Hayes knew that opinions and cultural biases meant nothing when compared to hard, verifiable data. He spent 2 hours taking precise temperature readings, measuring fuel volumes, calculating material densities, and analyzing heat retention rates across both facilities. The official thermal performance ledger for the Upper Missouri District during the blizzard of January 12 to 16, 1888, recorded the following metrics. Construction type: double pine plank at Fort Standing Stone versus conical hide and ozan liner at Tokahe's Lakota Lodge. Exterior temperature: minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit at both locations. Interior sleeping temperature: plus 22 degrees at floor level in the fort, compared to plus 65 degrees at bed level in Tokahe's lodge. Net temperature delta: plus 60, 2 degrees above ambient at the fort, versus plus 105 degrees above ambient at the lodge. Weekly fuel consumed: 2.5 cords of hardwood plus 1 ton of hard coal at the fort, compared to 0.3 cords of soft willow and buffalo chips at the lodge. Fuel cost equivalent: $145 per week at the fort versus $0 via local harvest at the lodge. Auxiliary heating required: 4 potbelly stoves at the fort versus 0 in Tokahe's lodge, utilizing only the central hearth. Air quality and smoke index: severe carbon and coal smoke at the fort, compared to clean air drawn by Venturi flap dynamics at the lodge. Occupant health status: 14 cases of frostbite and sickness at the fort versus 0 health issues at the lodge. Livestock losses: 2 horses dead at the fort versus 0 animals lost at the lodge. The mathematical story told by the ledger was undeniable. Tokahe's hide lodge held 43 degrees Fahrenheit more warmth than the military barracks, while consuming less than 15% of the fuel volume. But Hayes was not content with merely recording the results. He wanted to document the hard science that explained why the native architecture performed so extraordinarily well under extreme stress. Using standard thermodynamic formulas, Hayes broke down the engineering mechanisms into three core physical categories. First, the total effective R value, or thermal resistance. In standard timber construction, pine wood offers an insulation value of roughly R 1.2 per inch of thickness. The fort's double-planked pine walls, totaling 2 inches of solid wood, provided a total wall insulation value of just R 2.4. Heat passed straight through the pine boards via direct conduction, escaping into the wind outside. In Tokahe's lodge, the thermal wall envelope was a complex composite system. The outer buffalo hide cover provided an insulation value of R 1.5. The 12-inch dead air gap added R 15.0. The inner ozan hide liner added another R 1.5. The prairie grass and willow packing contributed R 30.0. And the external snowdrift buffer of 24 inches added an incredible R 24.0. This brought the total effective wall assembly to between R 72.0 and R 113.0. When heavy snowdrifts accumulated against the lower windward walls during the storm, the effective thermal envelope of the lower lodge jumped to an astonishing R 281. The lodge was not just a tent. It was a super-insulated structure that trapped heat far more effectively than any commercial building constructed in the United States during the 19th century. Second, convective heat stripping elimination. A major cause of heat loss in conventional buildings is convective cooling wind blowing across exterior surfaces and physically stripping away thermal energy. The wind speed hitting a flat wall accelerates convective heat loss by a factor of 20 compared to still air. The conical geometry of Tokahe's Tipi eliminated this mechanism entirely. The curved, smooth shape allowed 65-mile-per-hour winds to slide past with minimal surface friction, creating a low-drag airflow pattern. Inside, the baffled entrance design and draft deflector reduced internal air velocity to less than 0.5 miles per hour, effectively creating a complete dead air state. The warm air sitting inside the lodge was never scoured away by incoming wind drafts. It remained still, allowing the occupants to retain their body warmth without disturbance. Third, radiating thermal mass storage. A metal potbelly stove provides active heating. It burns hot while fuel is added, but cools down immediately once the fire dies, providing zero energy storage. Tokahe's hearth utilized passive thermal storage. The 600 pounds of dense river granite arranged in the central hearth pit functioned as a giant thermal capacitor. Mass of stone, 600 pounds. Average stone temperature at nightfall, 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Specific heat capacity, 0.20 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, bringing the total stored energy to 42,000 BTUs of radiant energy. This stored energy radiated inward continuously over an 8-hour period, releasing approximately 5,250 BTUs per hour into the small, super-insulated room, the exact amount needed to offset the minor heat loss occurring through the upper smoke flaps. Ensign Hayes closed his ledger, looked at Captain Vance, and pointed at the numbers. He stated simply that the Lakota Lodge was not a primitive shelter surviving by luck. It was an advanced thermal system, designed by builders who understood fluid dynamics, insulation values, and heat storage far better than the architects in Washington who had designed the fort. Captain Thaddeus Vance stood silently in the center of Tokahe's warm, quiet lodge for a long time, staring down at his own leather riding boots as they dripped meltwater onto the dry floor mats. The blue chalk numbers written in Ensign Hayes's survey ledger remained burned into his mind. All his life, Vance had believed that civilization was measured by the size of a man's machines, the complexity of his tools, and his ability to dominate the natural world through industrial force. He had looked at the open prairie as an enemy to be conquered with sawmills, iron, and coal, and he had viewed Tokahe's people as uneducated inhabitants waiting to be saved by modern progress. Now, standing inside a hide lodge that held 65 degrees of warmth, while his own military fortress lay drafty and depleted 3 miles away, the captain experienced a profound, crushing wave of personal humility. He realized that his engineering degree from the military academy had taught him how to build heavy boxes, but it had never taught him how heat actually moved. He had spent $15,000 of public money to construct a building that required non-stop human suffering and massive fuel expenditure just to keep its occupants from freezing, while Tokahe had built a paradise of warmth using nothing more than willow poles, river stones, prairie grass, and buffalo skins. Vance looked up from his boots and faced the old Lakota elder. He did not issue any orders, nor did he offer any patronizing advice about government rations. Instead, Captain Vance took off his officer's hat, held it respectfully in his hands, and asked Tokahe if he would be willing to send several of his experienced lodge builders to Fort Standing Stone. The captain asked if Tokahe's men would teach the garrison soldiers how to pack snow buffers around the barracks foundations, how to configure heat-deflecting stone hearths, and how to construct proper wind-baffled entryways over the fort's drafty doors before the next cold front arrived. Tokahe looked at the humbled officer, his eyes quiet and filled with a deep, patient understanding. He did not smile with triumph, nor did he demand an apology for the months of mockery his people had endured. Tokahe knew that winter on the northern plains did not care about a man's pride, his rank, his skin color, or the amount of money in his bank account. The prairie cold was an absolute, impartial force of nature that tested every living creature by the exact same unyielding laws of physics. Tokahe nodded gently and accepted the captain's request. He told Vance that his young men would come to the fort the following morning to help the soldiers insulate their barracks. Tokahe explained to the captain that winter was never an enemy to be fought with anger or heavy tools. Winter was a great teacher that demanded human beings slow down, pay attention to the earth, and learn how to guide the natural energies of the world instead of trying to crush them. In the days that followed, an extraordinary partnership took shape along the banks of the Missouri River. Lakota builders worked side by side with young Army soldiers, teaching them how to weave willow brush buffers against exterior walls, how to pack snow embankments without creating moisture traps, and how to line internal spaces with suspended canvas layers to create dead air insulation gaps. Within a week, the internal temperature of the fort's barracks jumped by 15 degrees, while their weekly fuel consumption dropped by more than half. Ensign Eli Hayes compiled his survey notes, measurements, and thermal diagrams into a comprehensive report titled Observations on Indigenous Thermal Architecture in Cold Climates. He submitted the document to the Department of War in Washington, where it was archived in the official records of the Army Corps of Engineers. The report proved beyond any mathematical doubt that the traditional building systems developed by Native American tribes were far superior in energy efficiency, structural aerodynamic stability, and interior comfort to the standardized timber structures built by Western settlers during the late 19th century. The Great Winter of 1888 eventually passed, yielding to the warm rains of spring, but the lesson learned inside Tokahe's lodge outlasted the snowdrifts and the cold fronts. It was a lesson about the true nature of human intelligence and survival wisdom, a reminder that progress is not always a straight line forward, and that newer technology is not automatically better than ancient knowledge. The true story of how Native Americans slept through 40 below zero blizzard nights is far more than a curious historical footnote about winter survival. It is a timeless testament to human dignity, deep observation, and the profound justice of natural law. On the open plains, where human arrogance was routinely stripped away by 60-mile-per-hour winds, survival was never won by brute force, expensive lumber, or loud claims of cultural superiority. It was won by those who possessed the humility to study the world around them, who listened to the physics of the earth. When the most severe winter in American history tried to freeze the Dakota prairie solid, the ancient building science of the Lakota people protected their children, warmed their homes, and preserved their families without wasting a single resource or causing a single moment of unnecessary suffering. Their victory over the Arctic cold was not achieved through complex machinery, but through a brilliant mastery of nature that allowed them to turn the simplest materials, earth, stone, grass, and air into a sanctuary of warmth and peace. As we look back at their remarkable achievement today, we are reminded that true human genius is not found in complex machines that consume the world around them, but in the quiet, elegant mastery of natural laws that allow us to live in comfort and harmony with the earth. The ancient libraries stored in the hands and habits of Tokahe and his ancestors proved that when human knowledge is aligned with the laws of physics, even the coldest blizzard night on Earth can become a place of deep, warm, and peaceful rest. Thank you for joining us for this incredible journey into forgotten history and survival science. What ancient survival technique or building method do you think modern architects should bring back today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And, if you haven't already, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to support more deep-dive historical engineering stories just like this one. Until next time, stay curious, respect the old ways, and stay warm out there.